Well, my name is Brian Winter. I have been archivist for the town of Whitby since 1968 to 2012 when I retired. I came here as a 7-year-old boy from Toronto in 1955 when my father was transferred by Dunlop Tire to Whitby. And when I first came to Whitby, the first thing I wanted to do was go back to Toronto. A few years later, I discovered history through a local teacher and made the study of Whitby history my whole life's work, and you'll never be able to drag me out of Whitby now.
I like to imagine Brian thinks of the WHS as part of his legacy. He's been with the Whitby Historical Society for 55 years and he's our longest serving member. I've known Brian now for 3 years as president of the WHS, and we've only chatted occasionally, but he always asks me how things are going. And I think it's this continuity of interest that inspires me, that gives the WHS its endurance, his unspoken dedication. At the heart of Brian, I think, is more of a storyteller than a historian. He instinctively recognizes it's the stories behind the facts that connects us to who we are. To Brian, history is in the stories, and it's the stories that create the history. When Brian tells a story, his face lights up and the audience is won over by a smile. You know, Brian and the WHS are synonymous and always will be, and we're lucky to have him as a member and as part of the organization.
When they signed up members for the Historical Society, I was the first member to sign up. And I was only 19 years old at the time. And they asked me if I would like to become archivist for the Historical Society. And I didn't even know what an archivist was, but I soon found out and began bringing papers and documents that I had collected over the years when I was in high school and put them in this, actually a broom closet in the room where the museum was. It was a passageway between two rooms. So I built some shelves, and this broom closet became the beginning of the archives. And after a lot of sorting and organizing, I officially opened the archives on May 10th, 1968. I think the important thing from my point of view, is that the archives was established as the first archives in Durham Region, even before Durham Region was established. And I remember one time we had a museum meeting of a local museum association, and this was 1971, where all the museums in the region worked together for publicity. But as one of the members said, the archives was an orphan. It didn't really have a place anywhere because nobody else had an archives. But we were ahead of this a long time before anybody else. And now you've got archives at just about every museum in Durham Region. And one of the things I did was, for years and years, I collected postcards of the region. And this would be in the period of 1900 to, say, the 1920s. And I was moving house and I had to downsize. So I gave the postcard collection to each of the museums for their archives. And I know Port Perry said that there were postcards that I had that they didn't even know existed. That was kind of nice to work that one out. Now, I should give some credit to a man named Frank Heiser, who was a grade 8 history teacher at Colburn Street School in 1961. And he was the man who introduced me to Whitby's history. And just at the same time as he was teaching this in the local school, my father received a lot of old documents from a friend of his that were related to what I was learning about in school. And that just made it all come together for me. And I decided that I wanted to study the history of Whitby. Well, my father's name was Guy Winter, and he was the head of product performance for Dunlop Tire in Whitby. And that was basically tire testing. Now, he was also a stamp collector, and this had quite an influence on me, that in 1961, when I was just getting interested in the Whitby history, my father had received all these old documents that I was talking about, and there are a great many what they call covers, which are envelopes with postmarks on them. And these were all from Whitby in the 1850s and 1860s. And he made a collection of them and submitted it to a contest at the Stamp Club in Toronto and won first prize. So I became interested in collecting Whitby covers as well. And after he died, the collection went to me, and I spent years going to stamp shows trying to find old Whitby letters. One of the things that I did was to constantly be searching for stuff, going to old-time families and looking for photographs and looking for documents and going to the stamp shows, the paper shows. I remember one time, this was nothing to do with Whitby, but it shows you what can happen, that I was a great collector of Winston Churchill and Mackenzie King stuff for myself. And I was at one paper show where there was an illustrated London News with a picture of Mackenzie King and Churchill together. And I was just walking over to pick it up. Somebody butted in front of me and bought it before I could stop. So it's sort of a competitive business. But one of the things that was good, I got a grant from the town and then later, of course, from the library to purchase all these things. And I give great credit to my scroungers. They remain anonymous still, but one of my requests. But the scroungers would find things that I couldn't find. And they had the ability to find things that just amazed me. The Marjorie Ruddy collection was the prime example. But I remember one time there was somebody who just walked into the archives and gave me a picture. And that's what happens sometimes. Some citizen from the town would just walk in and say, "Would you be interested in this?" And one of the pictures was the Ontario Bank building when it was a telegraph office in 1907. The important thing was to catalog all this stuff. So to find out who the photographer was, what the event was, and to put a biography of each of the portraits. Now here's an example that Tom Buckley, who collected all these pictures of Oshawa and copied them, he copied scenes, but he was not really interested in copying pictures of people. So, it's individual portraits. So I did this in Whitby. I got individual portraits, if anybody could get, of the pioneer times right up to the present time. And when they were put online, I wrote sort of mini biographies of each of them. So you can find out who they were, when they were born, when they died, where they're buried, and what they did for Whitby. And it takes hours and hours of work. Then getting a catalog of all the buildings of Whitby, all the articles from the old newspapers, and then identifying the buildings and the street address where they were. Some of them are gone now, but a lot of them are gone. And then the other thing was getting obituaries and biographies of Whitby people right from the beginning. The earliest obituary I ever found for a Whitby person was 1832 for a man named Deacon John Still. And I collected all these obituaries and cataloged them all the pictures. And then I would go around and get documents where I could. Now, for instance, the Ladies' College, which is now Trafalgar Castle School, had a lot of publications over the years that were done by the student body. And often they had more than one copy. So I asked if I could have the second copy for our archives. And there's a reason for this, that if anything happened to the original set of the Ladies' College, there'd always be a second set on another site. So these are things to think about. There was a man named Tom Buckley in Oshawa, and he had been collecting old photographs of Oshawa and copying them. And so he got me started on doing this. Now, he did all his own photography work and printing, but I hired a local photographer to do it for me, and searched around through the old families to find old photographs of Whitby. And it's amazing what was available. And the interesting thing was that the people who had these photographs, they were born in the 1890s or later, and they knew the names of everybody in the photographs from that period. So it was very helpful. There was a man named Robin Nicholson, for instance, who worked at the Buckle Factory, and I would take pictures to him, and he could name people from the 1890s. And he was accurate, too, which was good. One example was a man named George Fothergill, who went to the Almond School in 1896. And he had a photograph of all the kids in that school in 1896. And he was about 96 years old at the time that I went to see him. But he could remember all but 3 of the children in the picture, so it's almost completely named. Now, nobody today alive knows who the people were unless George Fothergill had named them when he was still alive.
When I was a teenager, my family moved to Whitby, and very much like Brian, I wanted nothing more than to go back to Toronto. The one thing that Whitby had going for it to me at that time was the fact that Leslie McFarlane had lived here. And Leslie McFarlane was one of my favorite authors. The internet was in its early stages at the time, so my source of information was the archives. And that was the first time I met Brian. It amazed me, this gentleman who I met, who I said to him, I'm trying to find some addresses for an author named Leslie McFarlane. And he said, I know where he lived. And he just rattled off the addresses and gave me all of the information right off the top of his head. And at that time, I never imagined that in the future, I would be working at a museum in Whitby. And I would be constantly tapping Brian's mind for information. All I have to do is call him up and say, Brian, I need to know about this. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And he'll always have an answer for me and an interesting story to go with it.
I can tell you a few stories about my high school years. That when I was 16, 17, I had a friend named Brenton Lamb, and he and I used to go out looking for historical stuff. And one day we saw a house on Green Street. This was March 1964, and it was an old rundown house due to be demolished. So we went and knocked on the door, and the tenant came to the door, and we explained that we were looking for old papers and documents. Could we look through the house? And half the house was empty. She was only living in the back half. So we knew what to do. We headed straight for the attic, and there was a crawl space and a trapdoor in a closet up into the attic. We went up there with flashlights, and we found, to our amazement, piles and piles of newspapers. These newspapers from 1882 to 1889. Most of them were the Toronto Globe, but there were a few Whitby papers as well from 1889 and 1890. And we were checking around, and it was kind of interesting because the building was right across the road from the old tannery, and the rats from the tannery had gotten into the house and had chewed on the newspapers, and it had also peed all over the newspapers. And we found a rat skeleton and a few other things like that. We were just getting down to work here when we heard a voice from down below that said, "Who's up there?" So we just froze and hoped that he would go away, but he didn't. And he said, "Who's up there?" So we came down and explained who we were, that we were high school students that were looking for historical documents. So he was the husband of the woman who had the tenant who was in the back part of the house. So he got the owner to come from Ajax, and we explained to the owner what we were doing, and we wanted take these old newspapers, which were a considerable fire trap from one point of view. And the man said, okay, just pass them down. I said, well, there's a lot of them. He said, bring them down. So half an hour later, he was waist deep in newspapers in the hallway down below the trap door. But we got the papers. Now, the Ontario Archives took the Toronto Globes, and there was also another paper called the Canada Lumberman, which was published in Peterborough, and it was from the 1880s. And the Whitby papers from 1889 and 1890 are now online in the library. Now, another incident that happened was in September 1963. Brenton and I went to the old Whitby and Port Perry railway station on Dundas Street, near where McKay Animal Clinic is now. And this building was due to be demolished. So we went into the station master's room and explained who we were and what we were doing. We wanted to look upstairs. He said that upstairs was empty and there was nothing there. So he let us go upstairs, and sure enough, there were documents of the 1920s all over the floor. But we knew that there were cracks between the floorboards, and there were probably papers much older that had fallen through the cracks. So we pulled up a floorboard, and there was a loud yell from down below. And it turned out that when we pulled up the floorboard, the plaster from the ceiling fell on the station agent's head. Well, we managed to get out of that mess, and we pulled up a few more floorboards, and we found quite a few new, old papers and waybills from the 1880s, from the old Whitby and Port Perry Railway. So this was a real discovery. Now, in 1963, we went to a house out in Almonds. This house was owned by a settler named James McGregor, and it had been empty for about 10 years. And we found numerous papers and documents, but it had been ransacked by vandals. And this made it very difficult because most things were damaged. But we got a few books. We got a Whitby Township tax bill of 1882, and had a good time just sitting out there in this house in the woods, sorting through papers with a transistor radio playing the latest music on Chum. But there were dangers too. It happened there were 3 open wells in the yard right around this house, and we had to be very careful where we stepped or we'd be in real trouble. This is earlier. This is before the time that I was interested in history, but I liked old buildings. And there was a house being demolished right about where the Bank of Nova Scotia is at King and Dundas. And I remember going through this house. At that time, I was only about 8 or 9 years old. And I found that the name of the builder and the date of construction were written on the wall in the basement. But as I was walking around upstairs, I fell through a grate, an old furnace grate, and the hole was open. And fortunately, the hole was small enough that I stuck at waist level. So my waist was stuck in the floor, and my legs dangling down below. But somehow I managed to get myself out without injuring myself and made it out of that house right away. But there's another good story that Whitby had an old post office at the Four Corners. And everybody says that that was the greatest mistake ever made in Whitby, to demolish this building. It was built in New Brunswick sandstone. And this was a beautiful building with a clock tower. And it was being demolished in May of 1959. So I snuck onto the site, and I was about 11 years old then. And I wanted to get some kind of a souvenir from this old post office. Now, I saw a postcard of 1908 lying in the rubble, but I didn't take it because I wasn't really interested in those postcards at that time. But I figured I wanted to get a stone and take it home, one of these New Brunswick sandstones. Well, there was one I found which was the smallest that I could get my hands on, and I decided that I would carry it home. So I just walked away with this stone in my hands. and nobody stopped me. And I got about 3 blocks, and it was so heavy that I couldn't carry it anymore. So I phoned my mother, and she came with the car and picked it up. And we took it upstairs and weighed it on the bathroom scale. And it weighed 37 pounds. Well, that's quite a hefty thing for an 11-year-old to be carrying around. On another occasion, I was in a building that was being demolished at the Four Corners, and in the basement was an old barber pole. You know this barber pole because it's in the museum now. Well, my friend Brenton and I hoisted this thing up on our shoulders and carried it about 7 or 8 blocks through Whitby to my home, went down into the basement, and it was very dirty, so we decided to wash it. So we stuck it in a garbage pail and took cloths and wiped it down. And when it was clean, we tried to lift it out of the garbage pail, but there was not much room for moving it. And we put a hole in the plaster ceiling of the laundry room at home by trying to get this barber pole out. And that was from Herb Neal's barbershop, if anybody remembers that, on Brock Street North. Oh, this is funny. This was from the same building that had the barber pole. It was the old Masonic Hall, and there was a deacon's bench, and a long, long bench, maybe about 8 or 10 feet long. And Brenton and I discussed what to do with that. So we agreed that Brenton would keep it. So we decided to carry it to his home. Now here we were down at the Four Corners, and Brenton's home was north of the CPR track, so it was a very long walk. One of us took each end of the bench, and when we got tired, we sat down on the bench on the sidewalk. And when anybody came by, we said, "Smile, you're on candid camera." Now in 1969, the town informed me that there was a house out in Almonds, right by Lake Ridge Road and Highway 2, that was due to be demolished. And we got permission from the town engineer to go into this house. And Brenton had gone off to another community at that time, so I did this one on my own. And I found it in this house, which was the Kempthorne house. There was a blacksmith named Charles Kempthorne. And in the upper room of the house, which had all been sealed off, there was a room full of papers and documents and all kinds of stuff from about 1900 to 1943. But the big problem was that when I got there in the rain to get into the house, the door had been nailed up. So I phoned from the local store to the town engineer to see if he could open the house. Well, he was out that day, so I took a chance and called the police chief. And the police chief was Bill Pilkington. Now, he didn't know me, and I didn't know him, but I convinced him that I was legitimate, that I was a historian trying to find old records and documents. So he sent a policeman around to open the door. Well, the policeman that was in his uniform and his bright, shiny black shoes, tiptoeing through the mud. And when he got to the door, he just put his foot out and kicked the door in. And there I was. So I got in there and found all these papers. And there was so much stuff there that from the 1920s and 30s, all kinds of annual reports from the United Church and letters from the lawn bowling club. Apparently they were in arrears for taxes. They were asking for money. And there were photographs lying around, some of them outside in the grass. And there was one photograph of about 1890 of the Whitby High School with a whole lot of children in it. And Robin Nicholson, the friend I mentioned before, who was about 80 years old, was able to name a good number of them. And so I was given 3 days to clear out that house, which I did. I took everything that I wanted, and my father got the covers, the old letters, covers with postmarks on them for his collection. So that was another major discovery. Now, the other thing about photographs is that it's a big detective game trying to figure out when the picture was taken, who took it, what it represented. One day somebody brought me a picture of some motorcycles parked outside the Royal Hotel, and it said that it was taken in 1935. Now, the thing is, why would there be dozens of motorcycles parked in front of the Royal Hotel? Well, here's how I found out. Beside the hotel, there was a movie theater. And you could see quite clearly on the marquee at the movie theater that the movie was playing was People's Enemy. And so I went to the newspapers, the Pickering ones in this particular case, because the Whitby ones were destroyed, and found an ad for the Royal Theater with the People's Enemy, and found out it was July 19th and 20th, 1935. Now, right beside this ad for the movie was a story about hunger marchers coming through Whitby on their way to Ottawa because of the Depression. And they were escorted by OPP police on motorcycles. So that was the clue. I knew now the date and also why the motorcycles were there. The police were all having their lunch at the Royal Hotel. And there was a sign outside the hotel in the picture that said, "Meals 50 cents." There was a mule train wreck in Whitby in 1916, and it was a simple case of the switchman being asleep at the switch and having it turned the wrong way, and he derailed a whole train full of mules that was headed for Montreal for the First World War. Now, when I was at the Ontario Archives in Toronto one day, I asked to see if there were any photographs of Whitby. They said they had some of a train wreck, but they knew nothing about it. And I looked at the picture, and there were the mules standing around the train. So I was able to identify it as the mule train wreck, and the date was November 2nd, 1916. The greatest discovery we ever made was through the help of a scrounger. Now, I had two scroungers who worked for me. One was an expert on eBay. He was able to get all kinds of things. Like, for instance, May Irwin was the actress that was born in Whitby, and perhaps one of the most famous people to come from this town. And in the early 1900s, there were dozens of pieces of sheet music with her picture on them, the songs that she sang in vaudeville. And through eBay, we got 90 different pieces of sheet music related to May Irwin. This is in the archives now. Now, I had another scrounger who just went around to antique shops and sales and auctions and stuff and had a tremendous amount of contacts. And one day he said he was in Kingston and found some negatives. And the story goes that he was at a hockey game in Toronto wearing a Whitby Dunlop's hat. And somebody came up to him and said, "You're from Whitby?" And he said, "Yes." "Well, I'm from Kingston, and I sell old photographs. And I got all these negatives from Whitby." So we bought some of the negatives back and had a look at them and identified them that they belonged to Marjorie Ruddy, who was a photographer in Whitby from 1935 to 1948, this particular collection. But the story gets even more interesting, that I had met Marjorie Ruddy a few years before and asked her what had happened to her photographs. And she said that she didn't feel that the people of Whitby really supported her. And she burned all the negatives. At least that's what she told me. But now we found all her negatives from 1935 to 1948, and that represented about 3,000 negatives. And over the years, we identified them all and made copies of them, filed them, and given them catalog numbers. And now all the Marjorie Ruddy photos are online. So if you ever want to look for Whitby pictures in that period, they're all there right on the computer. But that was the greatest discovery of all.